Welcome back, everybody, to the AI update on April 15th, 2026 for the AIX Higher Ed podcast. This week, we're going to focus on a really important report that just came out recently, and that's the Stanford AI Index Report. This is an annual publication from the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence that tracks and measures trends in artificial intelligence across research, development, policy, societal impact. It compiles data on topics like AI investment, technical performance benchmarks, public perception, global governance developments, and it serves as one of the most widely cited comprehensive overviews of the state of AI. Now, the report itself is produced by a multidisciplinary team and is intended to ground AI conversations in data for policymakers, researchers, and the general public. It's a really important report, and we wanted to spend some time diving into it. Now, this is a very recent report and current, but
one of the, as current as it is, right? And I've seen in the past reports, I thought it's just kind of it's a few months old, but it's like I think it's a 438-page document. And as you point out, it's compiled by an interdisciplinary team, right? So they're not just going to be kind of updating it right to the last minute. So I'd say it's like pretty current, though, like within a month. But even then, right, as current as this is and all the experts that worked on it, there's a lot of stuff that's happened, even within the last week and even just today that it, doesn't account for, right? So we've been talking about this new model from Anthropic, this Mythos model, which may be released now is 4.7 or 5 that everybody can have access to, that has all these cyber capabilities and reasoning capabilities. That's not covered in the report at all. So we were going to show you some charts and things, and those capabilities do not reflect the Mythos model. So it's supposed to release a model called Spud that's going to be somewhat similar. Again, nothing. A lot of the charts, like they capped out at like ChatGPT 5.2. There's a couple where they studied through 5.4, but where those are major model releases that not even considered.
So then you have other developments like the ARC AGI 3, the third version, a new challenge for frontier agentic intelligence. This is a series of hundreds of different interactive environments, a far more advanced AGI test, and this has come out just recently. And even with that coming out very recently, we see that, a model is already able to go from 0 to 36% on the first day of that being available. Obviously, lots of things are moving very quickly.
And, here we have, the OpenAI, they shipped like an update to their agents framework and agents kit. This just came out today.
There's now an extension to Word with Claude so that you can have it actually review your documents, like legal documents, and even allow it to edit your documents in Word.
And, we have also ChatGPT 5.4 Pro model. It solved another one of the Erdos math problems that was previously unsolved. And I guess this is one of the hardest problems that, the Erdos problems that remained unsolved. And, they talk about math, and we'll talk about some of the findings in the reports, the updates, but it doesn't account for this.
Also, the release by OpenAI of GPT 5.4 Cyber, a model built specifically for defensive cybersecurity, and a lot of discussion about its response coming from OpenAI after Mythos discussions. And OpenAI being very strident, saying this should be open to the public so everyone has access to this for defensive capabilities.
And I guess, and I know basically almost nothing about quantum computing, but I guess all the quantum stocks are up because NVIDIA released some chips that are specifically trained for quantum usage. And they released those chips onto the market today, right? So, and I'm sure they developed those with substantial assistance from AI.
Yep. And these are open source AI models that are meant for quantum computing that will allow for further capabilities, and still years away, but it's getting faster.
Something else that happened today, I'm sure with the support of AI, NVIDIA released some new open source models that were designed to accelerate advances in quantum computing. So all the stocks of the quantum computing companies went up because more breakthroughs are expected in that area. Something not covered in the report, obviously.
Greg Brockman is talking about how AI is going to let small teams match the output of large ones. But of course, there's a bottleneck in terms of the amount of compute that everybody's going to have access to. He says, of course, this is disruptive. Institutions are going to change, and we're really going to see some dynamics that change within the economy with regard to small teams versus big teams and really their flexibility.
So those are all updates that came out since the report was released. And we just covered them briefly because we want to show that, is forward, reflective, so to speak, as this report is. It doesn't account for these changes. But now let's look at the report. And to help facilitate a discussion on that, we actually kind of broke it down and organized it, with kind of some topic areas. The first kind of being adoption, use, and investment. And we can see that claims that AI adoption is spreading at historic speed, and consumers are deriving substantial value from the tools, even the free tools they access for free. Generative AI has reached 53% of the population within 3 years. Now, what's really interesting that I find, right, and our audience is primarily US. The US ranks 24th at 28.3% of use. So, we really kind of consider ourselves the most advanced country. I mean, we either have the most advanced models, slightly better than China, or China may have something we don't know about, but it's clearly the US and Chinese models that are leading the way, but we're 20 usage.
And what's also really interesting about this, and we'll talk about it, is the divide in the U.S., where you see some people really taking advantage of the access to the models and what they're able to do with it, and then also those that are refusing to. And when you look at the rest of this list, there's a strong correlation between really just annual GDP or median value per person and their likelihood of actually using AI. So it's more of a split between kind of the rich and poor gap that you see in the country and also within other countries.
And, the investment, right? Why is it growing so much? Well, the capabilities are improving because there's investment. Investment is obviously also helping to get it to consumers, right? To support use, to have all these kind of applications of it, to support the applications of it that people want. But it's really high, right? And it says private investment grew the fastest, 127.5%. All right. That accounts for 60% of the total. And I heard on the Moonshots podcast yesterday, April 14th, that the investment is about $3 billion a day, right? So right? So you have well over $1 trillion a year being invested in AI development.
And that represents global, but this chart talks about the comparison between the United States, Europe, and China. And we've talked about this before, but this really puts it in stark contrast to see how rapid that growth has been in the United States, looking at how fast that's jumped up between 2024 and 2025. When we first talk about global investment going that fast, so much of that is actually happening in the US. And that's because of access to the chips and data centers and the models being developed here in the US and the frontier models in those companies being located in the US. There's obviously reached a bit of a fever pitch, and there's really no way that other areas of the world are able to keep up in that regard. Although I think we're going to see over the next year that there's going to be a push to incorporate and build data centers in other parts of the world that maybe don't have the same risk factor of being in the Middle East or have the same pushback politically that we're going to start finding in the US.
And, as it's talking about almost all the models, right, are in the US or China, right? United States, China, the few, 5 in South Korea, 1 in Canada. There's like 1 in Europe, right? I could have screenshot a little bit more, right? But there just really isn't any significant model development outside the United States and China. And what's interesting to me is, for a long time, we thought that Russia is a superpower and they have a lot of military capabilities. And, they obviously have some AI capabilities and maybe some models we don't know about, but there's nothing.
And as we get into stories about companies developing frontier models that aren't released to the public, it's one thing when you have the frontier models developed in the US and everybody has access to them. But now if the US companies start developing more advanced models that aren't released generally to the public, that's not only public in the US, that's the rest of the world that is cut off from access. That's going to have there's going to be a really interesting story about what that means for further development and security issues going forward.
Now, let's look at, that kind of gives you kind of a general overview of the growth and investment and, where the models are. But let's kind of now look at the report in terms of what it's talking about, its capabilities. And remember, these are the capabilities before some of the breakthroughs that we just talked about. And it says AI capability is not plateauing, it's accelerating and reaching more people than ever. Industry produced over 90% of the frontier models, and several of those models now meet or exceed human baselines on PhD level science questions, multimodal reasoning, and competition mathematics, right? So, that's like incredible, incredible, what they call it, skills, knowledge, really kind of the capabilities, a combination of the two. And, we're looking then within organizations, most organizations, 88% have at least some level of AI adoption. And we'll reflect back on this in the education section, but 4 out of 5 university students are now using generative AI. I sent you, my son, who's a university student, sent me a TikTok earlier today. I forwarded it to you. It was basically a robot that they said was ChatGPT, and it said ChatGPT is coming to the graduation party because he's been with us. He's been with us all these years, and he's an important part of the class. So it's just here. I mean, we can talk about how it's not here. Students aren't using it, and all these types of things, but they're just using it.
Yeah. The other aspect of this that's really important is that they put this front and center. AI capability is not plateauing. A lot of people will see a new development and say, okay, that's where we are. We have to react to that point. That's not what's happening. And in fact, the developments are continuing, they're accelerating, and they're exceeding a lot of the benchmarks so that even if somebody is preparing for a report that just came out 2 months ago, they're already behind. That's part of the reason we had those slides at the beginning of the presentation. And also to underscore that you have to be looking further ahead to see what the developments are that are coming if you really want to start to get a grasp of how you can respond to these and how you can adapt.
And this really, kind of hits home. It hurts a little bit, right? As someone who's spent a lot of time on education in different ways, that kind of top line, right? Like the top horizontal line that's a little bit broken, that's human level capabilities. And it's showing that these models are all just kind of starting to push above human capabilities, right? And the one we just referenced, the PhD science questions, that's where you see the kind of the highest, right? That's where the black goes and breaks off. But we also see like reading comprehension is really high, visual reasoning is really strong, image classification is quite strong. So it just kind of if you look at these at the bottom, it'll show you, and you can look in the report. But basically, on kind of many metrics, it's exceeding human capability.
What's also interesting is to see that the capability is outpacing the benchmarks. And this is something we referenced just with the ARC AGI 3. There are new benchmarks coming out, and the capability is exceeding what those benchmarks are really able to measure. And not only being able to surpass what the benchmarks do, but surpassing human level performance. It's really important to see that and to understand how fast that rate of change is occurring. In this case, it references frontier models gaining 30 percentage points in a single year on the humanities last exam. And that was meant to be a benchmark built to be really hard for AI and favorable to humans. And that's already been saturated quite a while ago, and they've moved on to other versions of it. It's continuing to happen, and it's continuing to accelerate.
And they outperform, like we said, many human scientists. I was kind of shocked, right? Like frontier models outperform human chemists on, I guess, a chem bench score. It's incredible, right? Like, and most AI foundation models for science come from cross-sector collaborations, right? And you just start looking at these individual fields, and you see it accelerating beyond that.
But what's also important to note is that it's not always exceeding across the board at the same rate or in the same ways. We've talked about the jagged frontier before. A number of people have talked about this. Ethan Mollick, I think, coined this or referenced it, was one of the most notable voices to reference this a couple of years ago. You even see it on this slide where there's a reference that the frontier models cannot perform human chemists on the chem bench, but still score below 20% on replication and astrophysics or 33% on Earth observation questions. There's another point in the report where there's a reference that the models can, of course, do really well on math frontier work and get a gold medal in the math Olympiad, but maybe half the time can identify the correct time by looking at an analog clock. The frontier is jagged. It still is persisting in that way. And so it's important to recognize there are some limitations. And that's one of the benefits of the benchmarks, is to figure out where is it really capable and where isn't it, so that we can figure out how to adapt, because we also don't want to become over-reliant or too deferential to the models, assuming that because they do well on one, that they're going to do well on all.
Well, in April 2027, we should come back and look at that specific astrophysics score. But then we, right, in addition, right, that's kind of also just kind of human knowledge, right? Like, how is it doing? These are some benchmarks, right, about kind of capabilities. And I think this video one was more interesting than is even kind of being drawn attention to it, right? It says, okay, the video models are starting to capture how the objects behave. Google's VO3 tested across more than 18,000 generated videos, and it demonstrated abilities like simulating buoyancy, solving mazes without having to be trained on those tasks. And it seems to me like simulating buoyancy, right? That's a kind of a physics test. I don't know how it's kind of solving the mazes. Mazes are always hard to solve, except through trial and error. If you did one with your kid, but it's probably doing a lot of trial and error there and getting it to work. But to understand, it's not just the words, right? People keep saying, well, these are just language models. They just understand the relationship between words, but no, they're starting to understand, kind of how objects behave. That's something big.
Yeah, that gets into the understanding of world models. That's when it can get to the point of embodied AI being able to really take off. You get to this reference to frontier math, and it's a benchmark that's been used to measure all kinds of different mathematical problems and exceptionally difficult mathematical problems. This has risen dramatically since 2024, and this is really all frontier math that's measured by this, and went from about 0% in 2024 to over 30%, 31% in 2025. That's continuing to increase as well that we see, and some of the models that are coming out now, especially those that are particularly good with coding, and those that have been built for more advanced work, are going to continue to exceed that level.
Yeah, I know in some of our recent podcasts, we've talked about, it's solving problems that humans hadn't been able to solve. In one case, the professor said he didn't think a human would ever be able to solve this, right? And I just kind of point that out because that one and this one, they just studied right through the end of 2025, right? So it's not even just those things that kind of happened the last day, but that's kind of their cutoff for the capabilities they're discussing.
And this has an extension of that, looking instead of at frontier math, this is Math Arena, which is this rolling benchmark, and it looks at all the competitions, well-known competitions like Math Olympiad, AIME, and at USAMO, at Project Euler. And what they'll do is they'll run the models soon after the competition, and then have the models work with the actual questions that were used, the problems that were used at that competition. They do it soon after the competition to be able to reduce the risk of training data contamination. So there wasn't a chance that a model was trained on the results that were released after this. So this is one good way of making sure that it's really testing not on something it's been trained on, but applying some of the mathematical skills. And you can see how high this has gotten. It went from November 2025. This was in a matter of a month. It went, accuracy rose from 83% to 97% between November and December of last year. And again, that's last December, several months ago, and there have been big changes since then. So you're going to continue to see this advance. And that's one of the reasons why something like Math Arena is quickly not going to be that important as a benchmark. You have to look at something like frontier math to be able to measure what new developments would be and what the capabilities would be.
And I just kind of bring this up, and the reason I put the ARC-3 slide in there is because the report doesn't even talk about ARC-3, which came out in 2026, right? It's ARC-1 and ARC-2, and how the ARC-2 is saturated basically, right? And now we have ARC-3, and the models are kind of slow there, but we're already starting to see progress. So there's something really interesting here to talk about, other than, hey, yeah, this is basically already saturated, and we're on to ARC-3.
There's also an important part of the report that talks about how there's expansion of these AI models into professional domains, so that ranging from evaluations in tax work, mortgage processing, corporate finance, legal reasoning. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in some different areas, but it's really looking at the performance ranging. It's no longer just how would you solve a math problem in a vacuum. It's now how would you actually perform work that's done within different professional domains. And it's really important to see that it's range going from 60 to 90%, and the performance of these are varying greatly. And there are different ways that it's being measured now.
And here's just one. You should cover this one, since your wife's an attorney, right? But it's doing well there on the legal bench.
Yeah. And this is a really good measure to see how well it's being able to work through legal reasoning, working on tasks that would mirror real legal work. And you can see, I mean, it's hard to tell, obviously, because it's kind of small on the slide, but you'll see that it's pretty much across the board for many of these different models in terms of the accuracy, all above 80%. And, I would hope that all lawyers would be above 80%. I'm not so sure that that's necessarily the case. But we are finding that a lot of these models are continuing to improve, even as you see the new models come out.
And this one is just for assistant, right? For your kind of normal everyday office assistant, right? Like it does typical office assistant work. And it's already at 74%. I had someone actually in a class I teach told me they basically replaced her office assistant within one of the AI tools. These are, it's hard, we think about layoffs and, that makes it a little concrete. There's kind of a big broader debate about layoffs, but we're certainly seeing it in individual instances when it doesn't have to do all of what somebody can do, right? Can do nearly all of what somebody can do. And then they even told the person, all right, well, you're going to have to do like these few things now, right? With, the AI can't do these few things. So you just do those few things and use the AI.
And when I think about the course of my career, we've seen this happen not because of AI, but because of other technological innovations. We used to have a department secretary for every department. And, it got to the point where at that stage, you needed the secretary, the administrative assistant to help with almost everything in terms of booking travel, handling any kind of paperwork. Now, most of that's done electronically, and most faculty do that on their own. There are very few tasks that you really need an administrative assistant for. And so they'll have one administrative assistant to cover several departments. I think this is referencing that too. And part of it is the jagged frontier if we're talking about applying AI tools into the workplace. Maybe there's certain things in terms of like web browsing, file handling that could really be handled well by an AI assistant. And maybe some other things such as dealing with a cranky faculty member that might be a little more difficult by an AI agent. The other thing I would note about this chart that's really interesting to see at the beginning of January of 2025, it was down around 30%. It jumped up dramatically in February with new models that were coming out. And then it did continue to rise by September, getting to 74%. That's not far from a human baseline. Human baseline here is not 100%. And so we'll continue to see that increase. It's not as much about, is it going to reach a threshold and then it can replace a worker? It's, as Stefan was saying, you'll be able to have an AI assistant take over certain tasks, and then you can redeploy that human worker to do more advanced work or important reasoning or interpersonal work that we need to do. It's going to change the structure and the dynamic of most workplaces, and that's going to happen sooner rather than later.
And this is just something concrete, right? That people can relate to, right? Autonomous vehicles, right? We've really kind of seen the Waymos, right? Those are really the most kind of effective ones. Now it says, okay, they reached 450,000 weekly trips across the United States. Okay, um, and that's a lot, right? And in China, one of the companies, Apollo Go, they completed 11 million fully driverless rides. Now, of course, I mean, 450,000 for Waymos, right? You add that up across the months. All right, I can get up there. But China, you generally have a lot more driverless cars, and it's 175% year end increase. So this is a place we're going to start to see a lot of expansion. And of course, that it does. People say it has kind of replaced drivers. It's hard to tell because drivers, at least in the United States, are independent contractors, right? So you don't see them kind of fall off kind of the employment roles. But some people say, at least in LA, I read a study that said it really suppressed wages, right? Because as we all know, when you go to get an Uber, right, at the peak time, you pay more. Well, if there are more cars out on the road, right, it kind of basically suppresses the wage, which is already low for a driver.
And here's a chart. Sorry, go ahead.
And here's just, one example, right, in California, right? And, they've been out there in, San Francisco, LA, and, those are big cities. So you're going to see more of this. If you go back to our hometown, Erie, Pennsylvania, you're not going to see such a radical climb in driverless cars, but it really kind of shows you how big of an increase, from June 2023, where there's basically nothing, right, to, and it has the number of weekly paid trips, right, in thousands. So the top of that, you're basically at 300,000 a week, right? So December 2025, you're at 300,000 a week. June 2023, all right. So you're talking 2.5 years. You go from 0 to 300,000 weekly rides.
Also looking at productivity gains from AI, and this is in a lot of different areas. And at the same time, we see entry-level employment starting to decline. And this is coming out of this report. This, of course, is something we've talked quite a bit about. There are different explanations. Sometimes companies are laying people off not because of AI. They say it's not because of AI, or in cases where they say it's because of AI when it actually was something else. So it's pretty muddled in terms of how do you really parse this out. But within this report, where they're able to really do this in a thoughtful way and look at bigger sets of data, they were really finding that the lower level employment is starting to decline. And sometimes that's not as much about laying somebody off as much as not hiring as many. And that's because of productivity gains that they're finding. Remember, it's not about getting to a binary, it's good enough to replace workers and now we'll just fire workers. It's about reshuffling, reorganization, maybe reducing the number of people you need to be able to support a team, because you can have a number of those systems that are run by AI or done to support somebody running that for a system. And I think about my own work and how I'm able to extend some of my capabilities with AI tools. In some areas, it works really well. Other areas, it really doesn't. So it's jagged in even its application in terms of what I can do. It's not like I can say using AI is going to increase everything I do by 10 or 20%. If I have a lot of meetings, I still have to go to those meetings. And I still, even if I have an AI note taker, that's still time out of my schedule. But then there are other things I can do where maybe it's able to organize things further. So those productivity gains are really hard to say that a certain percentage represents much more other than kind of a leveling. And that's an averaging across different areas. So that's an important caveat. But when you get to a report like this and they're finding those productivity gains are happening in many of the fields where low level employment is starting to decline, you can see that there's a very strong correlation, and we're going to start seeing more of a causation that's occurring there.
And in our next major area, there's some reflections on education. Right, we talked about that at the beginning. I referenced, kind of the one part of the clip where it said, 80% of college students are using it. But the second thing that's kind of interesting, and we're not surprised by this working in education ourselves, right? Many new people are learning AI skills, right, at every stage of life, but they're not learning them through kind of the K-16 plus educational system. Not that any aren't, right, but most of the learning is not occurring there. And I remember this is a conversation that we had, I think, on the very first podcast we recorded with Adam Paxton, all right, at Arizona State. And he's concerned that, okay, universities, K-12, they don't want to teach about AI, or they're just not teaching about AI for whatever reason. Students are learning about that elsewhere. Learning how to use AI is one of the most important things that you can do, and can certainly even compensate for a lack of learning in another area, right? So kind of educational institutions will say that are really ceding the space of AI education to the private sector. And, it's incredibly problematic.
And I think we have to recognize that as educators, if we cede that to the private sector and we allow students to learn about it through social media or even through something that they learn online and they find something, we've given over control over dictating proper use, responsible use, ethical discussions. That's something that we need to be able to guide and be able to offer. Even if somebody's opposed to using AI in their discipline, they need to have discussions with students about the use of AI and how people are using it and why it might be important to limit its use. But you've got to have those discussions in the classroom. And it's important that this is noted within this report. So when we look at the penetration rate by geographic area, this is a really interesting report and something that most of us in the US probably aren't aware of. And to see that in India is really leading the rest of the world in terms of skill penetration rate in a way that's measured, and looking at LinkedIn and looking at and the AI Index Report, well beyond even the US, and the US ahead of Germany and then other European countries and the rest of the world going down further. This is not something that I think most of us would expect or that we're aware of. But in other countries, there's a saturation and use and penetration of AI skills and AI interest that's not really reflective of our own societal structure and societal responses. So it'll be really interesting to see how over this next year, when we see more politicized discussion and really some polarization over AI related issues, especially data centers and perhaps data safety, AI safety issues coming up because of US elections, whether or not that's mirrored in other countries. I don't think it will be, at least in the same ways, because there are other countries that are going to be deploying it in different ways, thinking about it in different ways. And the geopolitical aspect is going to be important to be able to factor into this too.
And this is kind of related to education. It doesn't have to be. I've been talking about this, but obviously a lot of the concern of education is writing and how people shouldn't write with AI. And but they're basically saying that we have the same amount of content being generated, at least it's published online, both from humans and from AI. It's about equal. Now, of course, you got to consider the weaknesses of writing detectors in tow, because that's how they're coming up with this, but even within the range of the writing detector, we're seeing kind of very similar outputs. So AI writing's becoming quite common at this stage.
Now moving into the next section on public opinion. And this is a really important one, and we've talked about it a number of times. But the report gets into this by starting off with some discussion of trust in government regulation of AI by country. And it's not surprising to see that the US is very low on this list. We've been talking about this for quite a while. We're very concerned about it. I've been pointing out for months that I know that this is, especially living in an area with a lot of data centers, that this is going to be a major political issue this year. It's just going to magnify the response and the PAC money that'll be coming in, leading the cause on both sides of the issue. So when you look at this list, Singapore being very high and over 80%, 81% in terms of trust level, and the US down at about 31%, I believe, at the bottom of this list. Very low overall. And that's something I think we're going to see that's maybe even be eroded further a little later this year, depending upon what happens.
And we see this, of course, right? We talk about jobs, and there's kind of two debates, right? There's okay, well, how big of an impact is it going to have on jobs, and then the short term versus the long term, but then also just how do people perceive it, and how worried are they about their jobs? And I'm finding more and more people in conversations, they're worried about AI replacing their jobs, right? When you look at Indonesia, China, Thailand, they're saying yes, right? It's going to improve the job market. Here, people are saying no. And I think it's interesting. It could potentially reflect on kind of the way the governments are managing this, right? Like in China, it's been reported, and I heard on the Moonshots podcast, that if you're like a medium to larger size company and you lay people off because of AI, you have to at least offer them job training with the hope of them getting another job. We also saw the statistic in the Peter Yang, right, Substack today, saying that youth unemployment, ages 16 to 24, in China is like 16+%. So the government's making all this money available to help people become entrepreneurs. They got to become single owner companies, right? And, in the United States, there's nothing like that, right? There's no, we don't have any kind of UBI. We have a decline in our social support infrastructure generally, right? Like various budget cuts in that area. We don't have any requirement. We don't have any requirement for retraining, and there's really no support for people who want to be and need to be entrepreneurs. So that does change, I think, how people view it.
And what's also really interesting about this is to recognize that the x-axis is the opinion on how AI could improve the overall market, and the y-axis is for your individual jobs. And the US is down at the bottom left, and there are a lot of companies that are countries that are down there. And it's surprising to see that when you have a country like China or Thailand that's up in the upper right quadrant, more than half of the people think it's going to be good for the job market, think it'll be good for individual workers. The tools are being developed in the United States. They're being deployed in inferences running through data centers in the United States. And yet the like 20% of people in the United States think that there's a potential to improve the job market from it, or only 30% think it'll improve individual jobs. Is it because they're close to seeing what's happening and they're actually a little further ahead of some other parts of the world? Is it because of the government policies and the regulations like Stefan's referencing with China? I think there's a lot to it. Part of it is also dissatisfaction with federal government inaction and the resistance to having any kind of regulation or any kind of support. And also, it's become very politicized. And I think that's going to have a further effect on this. I was surprised to see how many other countries were down in that same area with the United States and other Western countries, that they were as pessimistic as the U.S. is.
And, here's just a perception of the societal impact. Overall, do people think this is going to be good for society or bad for society? And the pink is like the AI experts, right? The people who know most about the AI. They see all these positive opportunities, right? In, medical care. They see it in K-12 education. They believe in job augmentation, the economy, all these different areas. And like many people, they don't see that there's going to be a lot of benefit to personal relationships, to hanging out with the bot in the evening. So they're skeptical there. But overall, they see pretty dramatic, the potential for pretty dramatic benefits. Whereas kind of just your average person, does not really think it's going to improve medical care or, the educational system or, how they go about their daily work.
One way to read this, and One aspect of this that is probably worth noting, when we go back to a few slides and we're thinking about the penetration levels or the usage level in different countries, and you saw that like 51% of the world has used in the first 3 years of generative AI, but Singapore was much higher. Other countries were much higher. The US was 24th. What's important to see there is that the US wasn't at the bottom of the list, though, for penetration in certain fields. That was based on LinkedIn information. What we're really identifying is that there's a big gap between the people that are using it extensively, developing some expertise with AI tools, and those that are rejecting or are resistant to the use of AI. And that's referenced here. So when you think about US adults in general, that's probably going to encompass more of those people that are resistant, that haven't used a lot of AI or don't want to use a lot of AI, are worried about AI. And then the people that are experts, are they self-selected as maybe they're experts because they already feel positive about these issues? That might be a little bit of it. Some of it also, maybe a more charitable read to the AI companies, is that the AI experts are the people that once they've been able to use the tools extensively and think about how they could be applied, they have a greater appreciation for the benefits in terms of societal impact in these different areas. There are different ways to read it. I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. But what is striking to me and is a really important consideration is that there is a real gap. And I think it's growing as people are becoming more resistant to AI, as it's politicized. I think you'll have people that will dig in their heels and be more resistant to using it later, especially if they see this as something that could disrupt their job or their sector of the job market. And then others are going to run away with it in terms of deploying it, using it, and finding a greater advantage. And unfortunately, it seems like it's going to mirror a lot of what happens with the rich-poor gap in terms of access to other resources. This is another resource that, unless somebody is given access to it, is taught how to use it effectively, they're going to be left behind.
This is kind of companionship, daily adoption by adults, right? And this is projections, right? So 2027 to 2040, generally across the public, right, we're going to hit about 20%. Experts saying, oh, we're going to get up about, maybe to the, I guess that's about 25%, but really could go as high as they're saying like 45%, which is a little bit, 25% still pretty high. 40%, I always think of that as almost half, which I guess it is. And you have, almost half of society having some kind of a personal relationship with an AI. It just kind of, you can kind of be like, well, that's a little disturbing, or you can kind of react and say it's odd, but you don't have to go that far, right? You don't have to, maybe that's insensitive, maybe that's not the best way to say it, but just think about how much it's going to change society, whether you want to kind of, kind of have a normative kind of reaction to it or not. When you have half of your population kind of have a friend that's an AI.
Yeah, it's certainly going to change the fabric of society, the dynamic between people. If some people are so used to working with an AI companion or some kind of AI friend, how is that going to change their friendship with other people, or will they have the same friendships with other people? And that's a real concern. Well,
So,
that gets to the end of the show. We encourage you to go and dig in yourself. You can find the entire report available for free online. We'll put a link in the comments for the podcast. If you've made it to the end, we appreciate that. Thank you. Please make sure you subscribe and follow us so that you can see other updates as they come out and other interviews that'll be coming out soon. We have a series of great interviews that we're excited to share in the coming weeks. And we'll have another update next week, as I'm sure there'll be a lot that happens in the next few days. Thanks, Stefan.
Thank you, Anand.